Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Montreal Mobstars. Today, we're looking into the life and death of Monica Proietti, also known as Machine Gun Molly, or as the French-speaking press referred to her, Monica La Mitraille. Monica was born into a Montreal-based family of criminals and grew up in the city's red light district. Monica became famous with Montrealers as a bank robber in the 1960s who, according to urban legend, would bring her kids with her to robberies so she wouldn't get shot at. If Al Capone had a daughter, he would have wanted her to be Monica Proietti, said a reporter at the time. The Proietti family grew up during the 1940s in Montreal's red light district at 93 Ruelle-le-Duc. The neighborhood, infamously known throughout North America for its gambling houses, brothels and bordellos, and other social vices easily accessible to those looking to spend money on a good time. Ruelle-le-Duc was a small alley with rows of tenements on either side of the street, in a neighborhood notorious for men coming 24 hours a day to spend money on experiences. It was on these dangerous streets filled with crime of all types that lacked any place for children to play that Monica Proietti and her siblings grew up on. The red light district of Montreal was located in East Montreal on the streets of de Bullion, Saint-Dominique, Saint-Laurent, Saint-Guinet, Colonial, and any of the side streets south of Dorchester and north of St. Catherine. The district and its houses of ill repute had been around at some capacity since the 19th century, and its gambling and whorehouses had been an issue for the city by 1905 when Mr. Justice Henri Taschereau asked, "Why have these houses not been raided?" after concluding an inquiry into the relationship Montreal police had with the brothel keepers, typically organized crime members or associates. With police effectively paid to look the other way, gangsters had control of Montreal's red light district, which gave it the status as an open city where basically anything goes. It was reported that when things got out of hand with drunken, disorderly clients at any of the countless brothels, and a madam was forced to call the police to keep the peace, all of the officers on duty, after hearing the call on the radio, would drop what they were doing to answer the call, knowing that the madam would give the first officer to arrive on scene a freebie session with one of the girls. In 1919, a pamphlet called Wake Up, Montreal was published by Evanston I. Hart, who was then the president of the Canadian Citizenship Association. In the pamphlet, Hart described Montreal's prostitution problem as a social evil, which was sanctioned by higher-ups in the city's government and police department, whose orders were carried out by the beat patrolmen. The higher-ups allowed the brothels to remain open as a result of corruption, with both cash and services given to those empowered by the brothel keepers. And as a result, the brothels whose owners were friendly with the police were allowed to operate openly. Women would lean out windows to shout their prices at passing by men. Even young delivery boys running an errand in the red light district for their employers may be propositioned by the women, which was of great concern to many of the city's law-abiding citizens. The area encompassing Montreal's red light district and its number of brothels exploded in size during World War II, when Canadian soldiers and Marines would pass through the city on their way to the front lines of Europe. For the captains of industry and government officials, there were high-class uptown brothels who were serviced by the most attractive ladies employed by the owners of the brothel, who typically ran many other brothels as well. For the less affluent clientele, such as the city's laborers and the Canadian Army servicemen passing through the city, there were many lupanars, lower-priced brothels where the brothel keepers' less attractive women were found. Montreal-born poet John Glasgow wrote of the red light district in his 1973 poem entitled Montreal, Homes of the Pink-Gartered Barrel-Bellied Horse, the garlicky laughter and the gramophone, smells of 1,000 sweaty nights. During the height of World War II, the Canadian Army noticed a worrying trend. 5 times as many venereal disease cases were diagnosed with soldiers passing through Quebec than soldiers in British Columbia, and the clap was affecting the war effort. At the time, there was no effective cure for venereal diseases, and contracting gonorrhea, as an example, between the years of 1934 and 1937 required on average a 50-day hospitalization, with 28% of patients experiencing complications, according to the U.S. Army. By 1941, hospitalizations for gonorrhea were reduced to an average of 20 days, thanks to the advent of sulfonamide drugs, which treated the symptoms but left the patient asymptomatic, meaning they could continue to spread the sexually transmitted infection. The Canadian Army couldn't have their soldiers going to a Montreal brothel and then to the hospital for STI treatments instead of directly to the front line, and high-ranking officers demanded the city's government officials to permanently shut down the red light district's brothels. Refusal to do so would force the Canadian Army to prohibit its soldiers, officers, etc. from entering the city, an act that would bring great shame to the city from the rest of the country. Mothers across the land would learn that their virginal, sheltered teenage sons were catching gonorrhea, syphilis, and other venereal diseases under the watchful eye of the Canadian Army, in where else but Montreal, Canada's Sin City. In February 1944, civil officials bowed to the immense pressure put upon them by the Canadian Army. The city successfully forced most of the brothel owners to shut their doors, never to reopen. Monica Proietti was born February 25, 1939, in Montreal's red light district, into a dirt-poor family whose father, when in the picture, was frequently unemployed. Monica was the oldest child with 8 younger siblings, and the family lived with the family matriarch, the children's paternal grandmother. The family home was a Victorian-era slum without any of today's modern conveniences. Rooms were extremely cold during the winter, and any sense of privacy would have been a luxury for any of the 10 persons living in the small apartment. As a result of their poverty, most of the family members were opportunistic criminals who used petty crime as a means to put food on the table. Monica's grandmother, Monica Proietti, was a seasoned career criminal who, by the time Monica was born, had already been in prison on 3 separate occasions for fencing stolen goods. Granny Maria was known to be a fence who received and sold stolen goods on behalf of neighboring thieves who needed quick cash. Maria received a commission for her work selling stolen goods, and, as an astute criminal, always on the lookout for a new score, Granny Maria thought of a way to put to work some of the countless neighborhood teenagers who aimlessly wandered around the streets. Maria opened a clandestine school for criminals to teach neighborhood kids, including some of her own children and grandchildren, to pickpocket, shoplift, and, unbelievably as it sounds today, to prostitute themselves. As compensation for teaching these children to become criminals, Maria would take a cut of the earnings of these underage criminals. She would sell their stolen goods and take an additional commission for selling the stolen items. Former police officer Roche Delanello stated, Monica's grandmother taught kids how to steal and gave them a cut of the take. There was no place for kids to play in that district. They roamed the streets begging and stealing. Nobody cared about them. Monica was taught to steal at a very young age to help provide for the family and put food on the table. In January 1952, when grandmother Monica Proietti was 59 years old, she was sentenced to 12 years in prison for her role as being a gang leader to minors. Judge Irene Lagarde said, "You are no longer leading children down the path of crime, ma'am. You are the most contemptible being I have ever had the misfortune to encounter." With her grandmother now in prison, additional pressure was put upon Monica to provide for the large family by bringing in more money. She dropped out of school in grade 5, presumably at her mother's orders. At the age of 13, Monica was arrested for prostitution on the sidewalks of Saint Laurent Boulevard. It was reported that every cent she earned as a child prostitute went to the family's expenses. Given that her grandmother Maria taught some of the neighborhood kids how to prostitute themselves in the red light district, it's reasonable to assume that Monica was at the very minimum taught by her grandma to become a child prostitute before Maria was incarcerated, or, quite possibly, trafficked by members within her own family. While it's not known whether any of her other siblings were forced to quit school to earn money, being forced into prostitution by family members was how Monica was told to bring home money for the family. When Monica was 17, she married Anthony Smith, a Scottish criminal 16 years her senior, who the local papers referred to as a romantic. The couple had 2 children, Jeanette and Anthony, and Monica was content with the role of being a stay-at-home mom for the young children. During that time, Anthony Smith provided for the family by participating in various crimes including armed robberies, while Monica stayed at home and tended to the needs of their young children. On February 3rd, 1958, 4 of Monica's youngest siblings were killed in their home when an oil heater exploded, trapping them in their city-owned home on Rue St. Elizabeth. Monica, who was married to Anthony but visiting her family at the time, tried to save as many family members as she could, who were trapped in the burning tenement, despite her best efforts to rescue her siblings from their second and third-story apartment. She could not save them all from the blaze as the tenement lacked a fire escape. Monica tried to rush into the fire to save her 6-year-old brother Giovanni, but was unsuccessful. Giovanni, 6, Jeanette, 4, Marcello, 8, and baby Michelle, 8 months, all perished in the blaze. Their mother was in a coma due to injuries sustained in the fire but later recovered. Monica believed that the explosion was an intentional act. However, when she went to the police with her suspicions, the police didn't act upon her accusations. The property, along with the rest of the neighborhood, was owned by the city and slated for demolition to make way for the Jean Mont's housing project, and it's possible that the city didn't care about the safety concern of the tenants. Some speculate that this tragic event was what caused Monica to snap and pursue a violent life of crime. At the time of the deadly explosion at the Proietti house, the residents of the city's notorious red light district were being displaced by the city of Montreal and the province of Quebec. Premier Maurice Duplessis had plans to raise the entire section of the city and rebuild the neighborhood as the Jean Mont's housing project. However, first-time mayor Jean Drapeau strongly opposed the province's plan to rebuild an entirely low-income neighborhood. In the end, the Jean Mont's housing project was built. On September 14, 1962, Proietti and Smith robbed Café La Paloma on Rue Clark, which was known at the time as a beatnik and artist hangout. Monica and Anthony entered the busy cafe at around 5 p.m. Monica had concealed in her handbag a revolver, which she pulled out and fired 5 shots into the air. Monica threatened the patrons and employees of Café La Paloma with the still-smoking gun, demanding money and valuables. "I will kill you all if you make noise," Monica was reported to yell at the cafe's patrons and employees. During the course of the robbery, Anthony Smith severely injured one of the customers of the cafe, and the pair were subsequently arrested by police. Anthony was found guilty in October 1962 for his part in the robbery and the serious assault he inflicted during the course of the robbery. For his punishment, Anthony Smith was deported back to Scotland as Canadian officials deemed him a risk to society. A small fact about Café La Paloma was that it was in the news in 1963 when members of the Front de Libération Québécois, or FLQ, Canada's French-Canadian terrorist organization of the era, held a press conference at the cafe. With Anthony Smith no longer contributing to the survival of the household, Monica was solely responsible for the financial responsibilities of the household and to keep her young children from starving to death. She didn't want to get back into prostitution, and with a grade 5 education and limited law-abiding work experience, she wasn't able to hold any legitimate work. With 2 small children to feed and keep a roof over their heads, she decided to become a getaway driver for a robbery crew that specialized in bank robberies. Her accomplices were impressed by her abilities to drive at high speeds while being chased by police, and nerves of steel that allowed Monica to remain calm during any situation. Monica rose quickly within the ranks of the robbery crew, from getaway driver to armed robber specialized in crowd control. Monica would often dress as a man, and she would command attention from those in the banks by firing a few rounds into the ceiling. There weren't many female bank robbers at the time, and Monica reasonably thought that dressing as a man would keep her from standing out as a female bank robber. Dressing as a man wasn't Monica's only method to evade detection and capture. She was known to bring her young children to banks heists, who would wait in the getaway car while Monica was in the banks making withdrawals by gunpoint. Her rationale was that a family car would be easier to blend into traffic when driving from the heist than fleeing criminals speeding down the street. Bernard Provençal, a member of the East End gang, Montreal-based gang of French Canadians, said of Proietti, "She committed crimes like any man, and her blood was colder than the hoodlums of the time." When her car got a flat tire on the Decarie Expressway and she was forced to pull over to avoid speeding traffic whizzing by, a police patrol car pulled over onto the shoulder behind her car. She may have been nervous that the officer could have recognized her, but she played it cool and batted her eyelashes at the patrolman, who was seemingly distracted by Monica's good looks and charm. With Monica in a hurry, it must have felt like the officer took his time changing the tire, and Monica appeared agitated by the lengthy process. When the cop asked her if she was in a hurry to get somewhere, she replied, "Yes, I'm going to rob a bank, and I have to get there before it closes." The patrolman thought she was joking and laughed it off while continuing his chivalrous gesture to help the damsel in distress. Shortly after the patrolman finished changing her tire and the two parted ways, she made it to the bank before closing and proceeded to rob it. Many of the men working in the robbery crews, prior to committing the robbery, had to resort to consuming sleeping pills or tranquilizers, known at the time as goofballs, and or alcohol to gather the courage they needed to pull off the heists. They were impressed that Monica was able to commit the robberies as sober as a judge. She didn't need any drugs or alcohol. Give Monica a gun and a disguise and she was ready to pull off a bank heist. It was while working in robbery crews with the East End gang that Monica met Viateur Tessier, who became her new baby daddy with the birth of baby Gilles. Viateur was a career criminal and robber who, by 22 years old, had already served time. Once again, Monica assumed the role of the stay-at-home mom with her 3 young children, while Viateur proceeded to rob banks as their main source of income. She was able to give her children a stable home as long as Viateur was providing for the family, something she never had as a child growing up in Montreal's red light district. Immediately following a bank heist, the family would go hide out in a cabin in the woods while Viateur would teach Monica the art of bank robbing. She would plan robberies with Viateur, who focused on committing bank heists in Ontario, where the banks held more money, until he was eventually captured by police in 1966 and sentenced to 15 years in prison for armed robbery. With Viateur Tessier in prison, Monica was once again left solely responsible for the family's survival, and she once again resorted to committing armed robberies, leaving her 3 children with her sisters while she committed small-time robberies. Now single again, Monica hooked up with some of the Dubois brothers and later brothers Gerard and Robert Lelièvre, whom she started to rob banks with. When the newspapers began calling her Machine Gun Molly or Monica La Mitraille, her boyfriend, Gerard Lelièvre, bought her a gold-plated M1 automatic rifle. Despite her catchy nickname, Monica never owned a machine gun. The trio went on a bank robbing spree throughout the city of Montreal during the summer that Expo 67 was happening. The summer of 67 was a busy summer for Montreal, which was hosting the 1967 International and Universal Exposition, which had participation from many nations, generating millions of dollars from tourism. Visitors to the city came from faraway countries to visit Montreal and participate in Expo 67, either as a spectator or working within their home country's pavilion. Montreal police were embarrassed that bank robbers were able to rob banks without getting caught, even with the increased police presence in the city on hand to protect Expo 67. Each consecutive robbery was like a salt in the wound, and Montreal police just couldn't catch a break with regards to capturing the robbery crew, a fact newspaper articles about the robberies would mention. Things were going well for the trio, who had a routine that worked well for them. Rob a caisse populaire, in English called a credit union, Monica's preferred financial institutions to rob, then go hide out in a cabin in the woods, return to Montreal and lay low for a while, going unnoticed as a family living their normal lives, and repeat the whole process. The crew were able to do this for 6 months and robbed up to 20 financial institutions during that time. It was reported the crew were able to keep this going for 6 months, and they robbed up to 20 financial institutions during that time. The spree netted $100,000 in illegal earnings, a sum that would have allowed the gang to live in comfort, as it's close to $1 million in today's currency. Montreal police were growing more and more frustrated that the robbery crew were able to pull off as many robberies as they did during the height of Expo 67. But with everything else in life, nothing lasts forever, and Monica knew that. She witnessed 2 of her ex-husbands get caught by Montreal police for their part in committing robberies, and she knew that the looming threat of being caught was very real. If she didn't put down her gold-plated gun, eventually the law would catch up to Monica and her crew, so she planned one last heist, a retirement robbery that she was planning to use the funds from for her retirement in the retirement capital of the world, Florida. On September 19, 1967, a disguised Monica entered the Case Populaire at 11,000 Boulevard Saint-Vital in the north end of Montreal, along with her accomplices, lover Gerard Lelièvre and his brother Robert. They successfully robbed the bank of $3,074, valued at almost $27,000 in today's currency. The robbery crew sped away in their 1967 Chrysler as Monica is the getaway driver, and minutes later the robbery crew hijacked another car, a 1966 Plymouth, and proceeded to drive down Rue Fleury and then onto P9 Boulevard to make their getaway. A Montreal police patrolman noticed the stolen speeding car and began to follow the Plymouth in his patrol car, with Monica again behind the wheel. Lights and sirens disrupted the peaceful Montreal morning as the police chase increased in speed, with Monica driving up to 180 kilometers an hour through traffic. Those who witnessed the chase may have thought that a movie was being filmed, as the scene was definitely big screen worthy. It had the dramatic suspense and action that any movie with a getaway chase scene would try to capture. When the chase reached P9 Boulevard and Dickens, now called Villeray, Monica was pushing the Plymouth to its limits as she tried to lose the police. She was weaving the car through traffic with speeds exceeding 180 kilometers an hour until the car slammed into a bus crossing through the intersection of P9 Boulevard and Dickens, leaving the getaway car inoperable from the high-velocity impact. Brothers Gerard and Robert were able to limp from the car and were captured by police, but Monica wasn't able to get out. It's very possible that damage from the accident was so severe that the jaws of life would have been needed to open the car door, and she was trapped inside. She may have been too injured from the impact to exit the vehicle, or a combination of both. We'll never know. We do know that Monica never exited the vehicle alive. According to police, Monica pushed her revolver out the driver's side window and she started to fire upon the officers. The officers fired back, lighting up the car with Monica inside. She was killed instantly when a bullet entered through the car and ended up in her chest. Her body was pulled from the car and laid upon the pavement for all to see. Passers-by stopped to gawk at the morbid death scene, and a crowd gathered as they learned whose body it was that lay before them. Machine Gun Molly, aka Monica La Mitraille, aka Monica Proietti, was dead on the eve of her retirement from a life of crime. She would never be able to take her kids down to Florida to live a happy, peaceful life as she wanted for her kids. She never had the stable life that many of us take for granted. Growing up in Montreal's red light district seemed to have sealed her fate. Monica never had a childhood, as she was forced into a life of crime from a very young age due to family pressure. By choosing to retire from crime early in her life, she seemed determined to make sure her kids didn't have the same horrible childhood that she experienced. We weren't able to find any information on what happened to her kids, Jeanette 8, Anthony Jr. 6, and Gilles age 1. Given that Monica had left the kids in the care of her sisters for a while she was on a robbery spree, we can assume that the family helped to raise Monica's children following her violent death, but it's possible that they went into foster care. Montrealers of all ages know the name Machine Gun Molly or Monica La Mitraille, whose life of crime lives on in the hearts and minds of those familiar with the story, which is captivating and tragic on many levels, and her story has been told and retold in pop culture even now 55 years after her death. Less than a year following her death, a musical comedy written by Michel Comte appeared briefly in July 1968 at Place des Arts, with Denise Filiatro in the role of Monica, to less than positive reviews. Strong but facile was how the Montreal Gazette described the performance. Aside from the local media tasked with reporting her crimes throughout the years of her criminal career, and ultimately her sudden and very public death on the eve of her retirement, the first time Monica's story was told to an audience outside the region was when Georges Herbert Germain published the book Souvenirs de Monica in 1997. Cité Amérique, a Montreal-based production company, developed a film based on the life of Monica Proietti. But when the producers approached Monica's adult children, Anthony and Jeanette, for permission to put Monica's story onto film, the children said no to the project. Even though Monica's children reportedly needed the cash, they refused permission to have the film made. The family, who played no part in any of Monica's criminal life, may have felt that they were paying for her crimes, and they naturally opposed the development of the film, as it would shine a much larger spotlight onto the Proietti name. In late December 2003, Monica's sisters, Lisa and Ida Proietti, were opposed to the production of the film based on the life of Monica, which they believed would bring further shame to the family, who had spent the last 30 years trying to move on from Monica's criminal reputation, which was virtually impossible thanks to Monica's infamy. The sisters demanded a permanent injunction of the film's production, which they took to the Supreme Court of Canada. The Supreme Court refused an injunction based on the fact that the family doesn't appear in the film, and the film was released in 2004. In November 1989, Monica's eldest son, Anthony David Smith Jr., was caught robbing a Caisse Populaire in Verdun. While wearing a paper bag over his head, he demanded cash from the teller as he threateningly brandished a toy chrome gun. When searching his apartment, police found various disguises and they were able to attribute 5 armed bank robberies to Anthony Jr. On November 30th, 1990, Anthony Jr. was sentenced to 6 years in prison for his crimes. In early September 2004, not long after the release of the movie Monica La Mitraille, Anthony Smith Jr. was reported missing by relatives. They watched him become depressed due to the attention the movie put upon his criminal parents and sharing the name of his infamous father, and his suspicious disappearance was cause for concern. His highly decomposed body was found 2 weeks later by somebody walking their dog in Otterburn Park, a small town less than an hour from Montreal. His body was found leaning against a tree in bushes along Richelieu River. It was reported that Anthony David Smith took his own life. He was 43 years old. Gilles Tessier, the son Monica had with Viateur Tessier, was arrested by Quebec police in 2012 on an outdoor cannabis plantation with almost 1,200 plants located in Namur, Quebec. He was 46 years old and in possession of a firearm which was seized by police. Gilles' criminal pedigree seemingly went to his head as he asked of the arresting officers, "Do you know who you're dealing with?" Who his mommy and daddy were didn't seem to matter to the officers on scene because he was arrested on the spot. Gilles was eventually arrested and sentenced to 18 months in Gatineau prison, and upon release he had plans to write a book about his criminal family, which never materialized. Robert Lelièvre continued a life of crime until 1984, when he was murdered by Hells Angels hitman Yves Apache Trudeau, who was hired to avenge the death of Frank Dooney Ryan, the leader of the West End gang. Robert was suspected by many of being partly responsible for the death of Dooney Ryan, and Apache Trudeau was hired by Alan Ross of the West End gang to kill those responsible for killing Dooney Ryan. Apache Trudeau delivered a TV and VCR concealing 15 kilograms of C4 explosives to the apartment where 2 of the suspected arsons were hiding out, which he detonated using a remote detonator. For more information on the bombing, please watch our video, The Life and Death of Sidney Leithman, in which we discuss the bombing in greater detail. If you made it this far, thanks for watching Montreal Mobstars video on the life and death of Monica Proietti. Please take a moment to give our video a like and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already done so. Let us know in the comment below what your take of Monica is. Do you think she chose a life of crime, or was she destined to become a criminal due to familial pressure and a lack of resources available at the time to assist a single mom? Thanks to the advent of sulfonamide, sulfonamide drugs,